Tapered cuts are often necessary in furniture making. The easiest way to make these cuts is with a tapering jig. You can buy them, but most of the ones for sale are pretty expensive for such a simple jig. So let's see what we can come up with using scrap plywood. I recently took apart a couple of old shop furniture projects, so I have a decent amount of scrap plywood lying around. I'm going to use it to build this jig. I'm starting with a light sanding at 180 grit to smooth some minor tear out from metal fastener holes. Being a shop jig, this is all the sanding this project's going to get. One of the edges of this piece of plywood was rougher than I liked, so I decided to rip this edge off to make it a little smoother. I'm going to be using the Match-Fit Dovetail System from Microjig to make this tapering jig. I needed to lay out the positioning of the dovetail grooves. The placement of this is mostly arbitrary. I just went with what looked approximately visually good for the jig. The dovetail router bit needs to be set at a 3/8 of an inch depth. I used a depth gauge to set my router. If you don't have a depth gauge, a 3/8 inch drill bit would work just fine for this. You can check for correct depth setting with this handy measuring tool Microjig makes and includes in their Match-Fit set. However, I forgot I needed to include the depth of my router track, so I needed to adjust all of this once I realized my mistake. There are a lot of ways to route these dovetail grooves. This is by far my favorite, but if you don't happen to own a Festool MFT and router with router track attachment, clamping a board to the workpiece and using it as a fence for your router will work just fine. You can also do this on a router table. Now that the main tapering jig was complete, I cut the runner for the bottom of the jig. This will run in the miter slot on my table saw just like the runners on a crosscut sled. I used a scrap piece of yellow birch for this. And I did a quick test to ensure that the runner slides back and forth without wiggling side to side in the miter slot. Then I cut the runner to match the length of the tapering jig. I could have left it longer. This is more personal preference. I used some nuts to suspend the runner just a little proud of the tabletop. I then used CA glue to adhere the runner to the tapering jig. Then I tested how well the jig slid back and forth in the miter slot. I needed to cut a fence for the tapering jig. This will allow me to make repeatable tapered cuts. I ripped this out of some more scrap plywood. Then I marked where I needed holes in the fence for the Match-Fit hardware. I eyeballed this. It doesn't need to be super precise. From there, it was off to the drill press to drill some holes. Now to test out the jig. This board is roughly 2 inches wide. I decided I'd taper down to 1 inch at the opposite end. I'm not shooting for anything specific with this, more just proof that it works. I lined my 1 inch mark up with the edge of the jig table. The angle I set for the fence is completely random as I'm just testing this. I should mention that I was careful not to cut the fence too wide because I needed the dovetail clamp to slide in from behind the fence and be able to reach over it to clamp down on the workpiece. It's also important that the dovetail clamps not stick out beyond the edge of the tapering jig table, otherwise the table saw blade will hit the clamp. The fence width that I went with here is 1.5 inches. And there you have it, a tapered cut. To finish everything up, I decided to apply some paste wax to the bottom of the jig to ensure it slides really easily on the table saw. Thanks for watching.